it failing to changing the night before.
And she said, oh, you miss a point, you miss a comma.
I always get performs. I always spell it wrong. And she put a comment on my
Okay, let's get started. Let's see where we are today. So here we are. Believe it or not, we are in week 8 here. Down here, week 8. So today I'm going to answer some questions. I don't know how long that's going to take. And we're going to talk about dashboard reports. So I'm going to do sort of a high-level discussion of dashboard reports today. And then I'm going to do some examples on the video module where I actually build some of these that we're going to talk about a little bit today. That's what we're going to do this week. We are about to start case study 4. I put a note there. And so next week we will have case study 4. And so my plan is to talk about that in class a week from today, and then we'll go from there. In case you haven't looked at the syllabus lately, we have 5 case studies this semester, and we got off by a week. So I'm trying to get Grant to make case study 4 easy, but he doesn't want to do it. So we'll see where we go with that. Okay, so let's see. So case study 4 again, and I will tell you in advance, case study 4 is an extension of case study 3.
So will case study 3 be
graded quickly?
Will it be what?
Graded quickly?
Because how we know if we made something
Will
wrong?
case study 3 be graded quickly?
What is quickly?
I mean, enough so that
terms
if
of-
we screwed something up on case study 3,
Like
we
in
can
terms
fix
of
it.
like
know in
a week
advance.
or the age of the universe? Like it'll be really.
I mean, let me put it this way. After you turn them in, if you want me to go over anything in class on Tuesday about case study 3, I'm happy to go over it before it gets graded. So if it's a matter of seeing your grade, that's one thing. If it's a matter of, hey, I don't know how to do this, I'm happy to go over it. Just ask. Okay, so I have a few questions to talk about. First of all, I forgot to talk about zip files in this last homework or in the last case study. When you turn something in, I always want you to zip the files together so we get one single zip file. So this should always be the case unless for some reason I explicitly tell you otherwise. I forgot to do that. Sorry about that. Okay, binding options, append, import table. This caused a problem for someone, and I looked at it, and it took me a little while to figure this out. So I wanted to mention it. I don't know how this happened, but if you go look at the bindings, let's say if you look at, I don't know, say my orders table, and I go look, one of the binding options here, this one, 2 under manual, 2 under the thing that says manual, it says enable, append, and update import data type. So if you accidentally click that, what's going to happen is instead of deleting all the rows or just doing a complete import, it's going to import on top of what's already there. Okay, and so this came about because the confusion was, I think, scenario A had 72 orders and scenario C had 68. So if you did A and then you import C, you're still going to see 72. Because with this option set, it's going to overwrite the first 68, but it doesn't delete the other ones. Okay, so make sure that you don't have that checked because what we want is a complete import every time. Where this becomes particularly useful is if you want to make small updates. So let's say I have a table that's got 200,000 rows. And there are like 10 rows that I'd like to change values on. You can use this feature, and as long as you have a column key, it will just import over top of those rows that are included in the CSV file. So it's a useful feature, just not for what we're doing here. So make sure that you don't have that feature set. Okay, case study 3. I want to talk a little bit about this. This was an oversight on my part, so let's talk about this for just a little bit. I think somewhere or a couple of places I talk about material running out, and I want you to track when the material runs out and then trigger a replenishment an hour before that. Okay, but that's really kind of unclear. If you think about when we talk about materials run out, in my mind, I was thinking about the case where you already have single quantity materials, right? So if you think about if I have a queue of entities here, let's see, here, and I have some material, right? And I'm interested in the quantity in stock, right? And if I always consume 1 unit of inventory, then at some point, if I'm going to run out, I'll have 1, the entity will consume it, it'll be at 0. The next entity will try to consume it and it will block it. Okay, and so when I wrote the question, that was really what I was thinking. Of course, that's not the case we have. The case we have is that you don't consume single, you consume quantities based on both the bill of materials and the number in the order. Okay, so we have a situation that's sort of like this. Let's say that I have, I don't know, let's say my quantity in stock is 12, and I have a demand for 8, then 2, then 7, then 1, for example. Okay, so on top are what the individual entities are trying to do. So what's going to happen when you execute this is this one will get it, and this will go to 4. This one will get it, and this will go to 2. And now we don't exactly know what's going to happen, or what happens depends on what exactly you're doing. So several different things can happen here. Okay, so for example, if I have the system set up where I have partial allocation of materials, okay, if I allow that, then what's going to happen is this is going to go to 0, this is going to go to 5, and I have 2 units reserved. Okay, and so that it is in a reserve state, and so it'll just sit here in this state until the model stops, or until the inventory is replenished. Okay, now this isn't technically at 0 because there are actually 2 units still there, but they're reserved. So when you try to consume from somewhere else, you won't get them. Okay, they're reserved by this guy, and when this guy gets his other 5, he'll get those 2. Okay, so that's one scenario. Another scenario, suppose you don't have allocation set. So I don't have partial allocation set. Then we still have 2 different options. Option 1 is if I have a blocking consume. So for example, let's say this is occurring at a server and I'm hit a consume step, like maybe in a task sequence. Okay, then this is just going to sit at 2, and this is going to sit here and block, and this one's going to sit behind the queue, right? Because it's in a blocking situation. Okay, let's say on the other hand that it's not blocking, so maybe we're using a constraint step, like you did in the model, where you have the constraint, the constraint element in a transfer node. If the constraint element's in a transfer node, this guy will jump ahead and we'll end up with 1. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different scenarios that can happen. And so what I should have said here, and that I then changed it to, was saying, I want the first order block on material constraint. That's what I want you to record. Right, so in the assignment, what I want you to do is do the sequential recording of when a problem occurs. And I had sloppy wording in saying the problem was when it gets to 0. What I want is the problem when the first thing blocked. So in this scenario that I wrote, it would be when this one tries to do the consume. Independent of what happens, independent of whether you have partial allocation or whether you have blocking or not blocking, that's the point in time where I want you to say, okay, this is the point, this is the time. And then in question 2, question 2, back that off an hour and then create the produce from that. Okay? Yeah, so that was, again, my fault. Sorry, that was confusing wording. Okay, so a more general question that has to do with ranking and dynamic selection. I'll let you read the whole thing, but it has to do with if we have a queue again, and let's say that we have a set of entities in the queue, and for deciding how they come out of the queue, right? Well, deciding where they are in the queue and how they come out, we have these 2 different related concepts. We have ranking rule, and we have dynamic selection. And so you can think of this as attached to a server if you want. It's more general than that because it also happens at, the easiest way to think of it is a server, but there are other places it happens too, like the routing out queue of a transfer node and all that. So the concept is more general than a server, but sometimes it's easy to think about it this way. Okay, so what this means is when an entity arrives, the ranking rule tells me where that goes in here. Okay, so suppose I have these 3 entities and my ranking rule is the default of first in, first out. This entity will go right here. If my ranking rule is last in, first out, then this entity will go right here. If it's some other metric like earliest due date in the examples that I did online, then it's when the entity arrives, Simio is going to look at all of these and it's going to compare its due date to all of these other ones, and it's going to place it somewhere in the middle based on where the due date is. So it just does a sorting. Okay? The key here is that it's static, and so that once you're placed in this queue, your relation to other entities in that queue never changes. Okay, so in other words, if I'm in front of another person, I never am not in front of them. If I'm behind someone, I'm never not behind them. Other might get inserted in based on what those rules are, but your relationship to the existing entities never changes. That's what a static ranking rule does, is it ranks the entities there. The dynamic selection decides, okay, when I want to reallocate the server, so I have my server here and this guy finishes, the dynamic selection tells me which one do I take, assuming I have capacity 1 server. Okay, and so the dynamic selection rule will look at all of the entities in the queue and do a whole bunch of different, or you select what it does, but it basically does a computation every time. Okay, so the one that I did in the video is least setup time. So it looked at least setup time, and so that is dynamic. And so, in other words, if I have sequence-dependent setups, this entity, like right now, might have a setup of, say, 30 minutes. But as soon as this one goes, it now has a setup of 2 hours because it depends on the sequence that you saw it. Similarly, if you do something like critical ratio, where it's the total work remaining divided by the total time available, then those are dynamic too. And so the dynamic selection rule recomputes every single time. Okay? Now, if you just go by default, there is no dynamic selection rule. It just follows this ranking rule. Whatever you tell it the ranking rule is, it just takes the next one in the queue. So there's no computation done once it gets put in the system. And that's the default. Okay, so the question that was up here is there ever a case where you'd want to use both of these? Okay, and if you watch the video that I did on dispatching, you will note at the very end, we use the multiple dispatching rules. So we use the tie-breaking rule, then we use the repeat group so that we could have 3 different rules and so on. And so when you want to have those kind of multiple rules that get evaluated to break ties, then you have to use the dynamic selection rule except in one case. And that one case is if you want a single tie break and it's static. So for example, suppose that I want to have least setup followed by EDD, earliest due date, which is I think the one that I did. Okay, I could implement that where this is the dynamic selection rule and this one is the ranking rule because it's static. Okay, and in this case, that would save me a marginal amount of computation time, right? Because if I have the EDD as static ranking rule, then it's going to get computed when I place it in the queue, and that only happens one time. If, on the other hand, I have my least setup, if I have both of these in the dynamic selection, they get computed every time. But since I have least setup already in the dynamic, I'm already going to go through everything. So the additional computation of doing this there is really small. But technically, if you had a static rule as your second rule or your third rule or your fourth rule, whatever that last rule is, you could make that static and it would save you a small amount of computation time. Okay? Questions about that? Okay. And the last question really isn't a question. It's really just I want to talk just a little bit more about debugging, as if you worked on this one, are hoping to figure out is that it's getting a little bit more complicated. These models are getting a little bit more complicated, and in case study 4, it's going to get more complicated. In case study 5, more complicated. And so understanding how to debug is critically important. Okay, and so we've talked about debugging in the past. So again, let me just go through just a couple of things that are really useful for debugging. The first one is verify along the way. In other words, start out with the simplest model you can, and when you add a feature, verify it. And then when you add another feature, verify it. And then when you add another feature, verify it. Because if you add everything together, it's much more difficult to then find errors. Because if you do this iterative step of verifying along the way, it's not 100% the case where the last thing you did caused the error, but a lot of times it is. Right? And so it's easier to find errors if you do verification along the way, because again, the assumption and what's true a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, is that last thing that you did that caused the problem is the problem. And so you have a smaller a population of things to look at to fix. Okay, so that's one thing. Verify along the way. I've talked about trace and watch. Trace, watch. I'm not going to repeat that because I've talked about that quite a bit. Hopefully everyone's there. And as I've said many times, I have never done a model where I haven't used trace and watch, a real model. Only toy models. Any model I have ever done in a real situation, I've made significant use of trace and watch. Okay? That's any model ever in my entire lifetime of using Simio and before Simio Arena, right? Because it's just it's part of what you have to do to debug your model. Third one is notify. Talked about notify a little bit early on in the class, and I cannot overemphasize how useful notify is, right? So for example, if I want to, if I go in a model, let's see what I happen to have open here. I have this one that I'm going to go over, my Obby Electronics. Let's say I go to a symbol 2. I mean, we know that I can put a breakpoint there, okay, and it'll pause the model when the entity gets enters the object. But what if I want it to stop after it's been allocated the resource, but before it starts the processing time, so I can trace just on the task sequence? Okay, I can't do that with a breakpoint at this level, but I can if I use an add-on process. And if I then use the notify step on top of that, I can get all of the information that I want. So remember what the notify step does is in a process, it lets you do either a warning, a trace message, or an error. And with this, you have a header and you have a body. Header, body. You can type anything you want. You can write, you want to just make a message like hello there, it'll do it. But you can also put information from the whole object model. You want to know the entity number, you want to know the quantity on hand in a particular material or an inventory, you want to know the server status, like anything that you want to know, you can include in the notify step. So if you do warning or error, that's going to pop up a dialog box and says, okay, right here, here's what's happening. If you do warning, it will pop up a dialog box and let you either pause the simulation or continue. If you do error, it'll stop the simulation. If you do trace, then it's going to inject this message into the trace. Okay? And if you use the colorization of the step, then when you look at the whole trace, these specific messages that you want are going to jump out. Okay? So if I were to show you real models that I've done, like consulting models or project models, and you looked at the process steps, you're going to see 10 different colors of steps because I use the color to tell me what that notify is telling me. So I can just look at a long trace and say, hey, there are the orange ones. That means I'm assigning something. Or here are the blue ones, and that means something else. And so it's just incredibly useful tool when you're trying to figure out what's going on. Okay, so verify along the way, trace and watch. And then this third one, or the fourth one, the last one, is you have to learn how to, let's see, for a lack of better term, say, modify my model. Modify the model. And what I mean by that is modify the model until you can get it in to where it behaves as expected. So let's say, for example, you're having trouble with material consumption. And let's say you have, a constraint logic element. The first thing I would do is take the constraint logic element out. Just take it out of the model. And if the model runs as expected, then I'm going to put the constraint logic element back in and then search and say what's going on here. Okay, so the key is you've got to modify the model so that you can get it in a state that you understand what's going on, and then add something back in to try to get to the state where you don't know what's going on. And the whole reason that you're doing that is trying to isolate the conditions that cause the error. Okay, and so do things like take things out, put things in. We are dealing with tables that are, 150 orders. Make a one order table, just one. You want to see when the material runs out? Well, make the material consumption the exact same as the number available, or one more or one less. And so you can get it in a state where you know exactly what's happening, make it happen, and then add stuff back in to try to get to the point where you had the original error. Okay, and there's no other way. When you're doing models that are complex, you're going to do these things, or you're going to, be frustrated to death if you don't learn to do these. Okay, because there's nobody who can just sit down and create the model and then click go, and it goes. Okay, so you have to get used to doing debugging. And if you do the debugging and you don't like debugging, you probably don't want to do a career that involves a lot of simulation because there's just no way around it. Okay, there's no way around it. So what you have to do is learn to do it. Okay, and practice, the practice makes perfect adage is exactly true with debugging. Okay? I think that's all my questions. That's all the stuff that I got in email. Does anybody have any other questions they want me to answer?
Is the model in week 7 videos the correct model for case study 3? The one that you use in the videos?
Is the one I used in the video correct for case study 3? I have made a data error somewhere. There was a data error, a couple of things, like I did some of the changeovers I changed, but the model itself,
It looks like
I mean, it doesn't do the part 2.
Yeah.
So the video doesn't include the part 2 where you...
Yeah, but in week 6, also you use some times that are not the same in the case study.
Mhm.
So, I don't know.
So you should read the times. The structure is the same. The times changed.
Week 6 video modules.
Week 6. I don't remember which week 6 video. Week 6 was case study 3. Yeah. So
So it's based on that.
the numbers changed a little bit in a couple of places, like one of the setups and a couple of the processing times, but the structure is the same. Yeah, as for 3. There was one other mistake I made is in the video, I didn't multiply the quantity, the order quantity times something, but the structure of the model is the same. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Let's talk about dispatching. And I have a subtitle for these slides. This is new to me also. I have not done that. I've done dashboards. I've done data filtering, but never Simio dashboards. The ones that I'm going to show you here and that I'm going to record for the video are the very first ones I did other than a very simple one. Okay, so my knowledge in some of these details is extremely limited. So if you post something on Canvas or email me and say, how can I make my dashboard do blah? I'm very likely to say, I don't have any idea, but why don't you try this and then try this and then try this and then try this? Okay, because I'm going to say a couple of things here. First, the interface for this dashboard creation tool is not intuitive to me. It might be intuitive to you. It's intuitive to some people, but it's just not for me. So I end up doing a lot of trial and error. Okay. On the other hand, it's a great opportunity for you to participate and get points for participation and help people by saying, here's how you do that. The other thing that you'll note is that we have imported the XML files, and so dashboards using this tool, you can export the XML and import the XML. So as long as the table structure that you use is the same, or you are just using log files, you want to share your dashboard with someone else, just send them the XML file. Okay, and so there's a lot of opportunity here for you to exploit that to your advantage if dashboards happen to be something that you like or are good at or whatever. Yeah.
For the first video module, you use a simple
Yeah.
scorecard thing, but in the web page, there is only the scorecard, the one that has more things.
Yeah, I fixed that right before class. I figured out that I had the wrong one. And so what she's talking about is if you haven't watched the dispatching, when I used a dashboard that includes like 6 or 7 numbers, the key performance metrics, that's what I used all through the video. And then I said, here's the XML file, but I actually ended up giving you the XML file for a much more complicated dashboard. I fixed that right before class. So you can download the one that I use in the video is there now. Okay. So what is a dashboard? Well, first of all, a dashboard is not in any way specific to Simio. A dashboard is a very common thing, getting more and more popular. I just grabbed a definition from Wikipedia. It's graphic user interface, which often provides at-a-glance views of KPIs relevant to a particular objective or business process. Okay, and so I have one here. This is the one I'm going to look at here. So I've got this in Simio. So let me open it there rather than look at it here, and then I'll just talk a little bit about it. So this is your favorite model. It'll be electronics with a whole bunch of dashboards that you're going to see in the video module. Let's see. Let me see if I can remember how to go to it. I don't have my mouse. That's what's wrong. I kept saying something's wrong. This is harder than usual. My mouse. Now my mouse doesn't seem to have any batteries. Let's see. Okay, my mouse is back. Okay, so dashboard reports. There's the MakeSpan dashboard. We've seen that one. I've used this one on the very second class and showed you how to do that. So it just reports one number. The one that you're talking about, Eliana, is this one. This is the one I use in the video module on dispatching, because we were looking at different dispatching rules and we're just looking at these KPIs. And so what these two do, the one that just shows MakeSpan and this one is it shows you in one place something that you're interested in. So from the dispatching information, what I was interested in is late orders, unshipped orders, MakeSpan, and this number and total time of changeover. Because all that information is available in the log files or in the tables and all of that, but if I make the dashboard, it's right there. And so when I say, hey, let's change, let's flip the order of EDD and critical and lease setup and see what happens, and I can see in one place what happened to all of my metrics. Okay, and so really that's kind of the basic idea. In both of these two simple ones, though, they're static. Right? It shows me what happens when I do a run. But in most of the useful ones, like this one that's that I'm going to talk through here, it's dynamic. Okay, and so this is a dynamic dashboard. And I will say that I didn't make this one by myself. One of my other PhD students made it for me, and then I took it and made some changes to what he had done. As I said, I've never made dashboards before, so 2 weeks ago I gave him the task of say, hey, learn how to do dashboards and then teach me. It's one of the awesome parts about being a faculty member with PhD students. And so he did, and this is a result. But all the other ones I did myself that I'm new to. And so if you look at this dashboard, what you see, and so this is, again, from Avi Electronics, and so we're interested in orders, and orders can be, late or on time or unshipped. We have 3 different module types. We have 4 different colors. We're interested in MakeSpan. We're interested in end time. We're interested in, we might be interested in proportions of different order types. Okay, and so when I say this one is dynamic, and that if I just want to see the unshipped orders, I can click there, and then everything updates to just the unshipped orders, other than those 2 things, the MakeSpan and the total changeover time, which aren't related in any way to orders. Everything changes. So I just said, show me the unshipped, and if you look, this changed, that changed, all of these orders changed just to filter out to the unshipped ones. If I'm interested in the late ones, I can then do quickly filter to that. If I'm interested in, say, both of those, the late and unshipped, I can see all of those together. If I want to go and say, well, show me the unshipped orders that are module A, right? And so they sequentially, it will work with, if I just want to say the blue module A's, for example, the blue unshipped module A's, there they are. Okay, and so with a dynamic dashboard, it lets me quickly understand what's going on with it. The idea is, if you have a well-constructed dashboard, it lets me quickly figure out what's going on. Okay, all of this information, again, is pulled from your table data, the log data. So it's already all there. There's nothing new that this is telling me. It's just giving me a nice user interface so that I can see what I want to see. Okay? And in the dispatching video, again, you see that I did that because I wanted to always look at those metrics and how those metrics were impacted by by changing the dispatching rules. Okay, so when we talk about dashboards, that's what we mean. Now, as I said, dashboards are in no way specific to Simio. So I went on Google and just searched for dashboards, and then I don't know, the 3rd or 4th entry said, here's a whole bunch of images on dashboards, so you can just sort of see the structure all over the place. Okay, and they have a whole lot of tools that are dedicated to doing that kind of thing, like Tableau and Power BI and a whole suite of other tools that are useful for doing that. And in fact, I know for a fact that some larger Simio customers use Tableau. So instead of using the built-in features in Simio, they export all the table data, and then they use Tableau to do the same kind of thing. Okay, so again, the Simio implementation is a particular implementation of a dashboard tool, but the concept of dashboards is much broader. And you can see there are like thousands of them for everything you can possibly imagine. Okay, so when we talk about dashboards, that is what we mean. So some key concepts here. I'm going to talk about all of these key concepts. Grid type presentation. You can see that here. This is what I mean when I say grid. This is an example of a grid type presentation. Some visualizations. I just have one simple one there, the pie chart. The notion of cards are really important. This is a single card. That up there, the resource is a single card with multiple fields. So cards like display information, but they do more than that. If you look up the help, it's something confusing. I don't even remember what it is, but it's very confusing. It displays information, it can calculate information, and it can do simple querying. But they're very useful. And when you look at the interactive ones that I did before, you're basically clicking on the cards. And when you click on the cards, it does filtering and things like that. Calculated fields, as I said, filtering, interactivity, and then planning versus experiment report. So those are the key concepts that I'm going to talk about today, at kind of a high level, and then in the video I'll show how to do all those things. And of course I have my question mark here because since this is new to me also, there are probably key concepts that I don't even know, okay, that I didn't even know to put on there. So I want to make it perfectly clear that, hey, I'm new to this too. And almost certainly one thing that comes with that is I will lead you astray at some point. I will either make a mistake or I will not know something, or so, don't be surprised when that happens. There are two sim bits that I'm going to mention today, but I'm not going to show them, but you should have a look at them. One of them is dashboards for scheduling examples. And so what dashboards for scheduling examples does is basically shows you how to build this one, or one that's almost exactly like this one. Okay, this one has to do with, yeah, it is this one actually. I can't remember. It's either this one or something just like this one. And it shows you step by step. Click here, drag here, click here, drag here, and all of that. It shows you that step by step. So I'm not going to do this one on the video module for this week, but that's another example. My plan, I haven't done the video module yet. My plan is to do 3 separate dashboards. So this would be a 4th one to supplement that. So the examples that I have done, all of them, include, so across the top is the tool, all of the components that you can have. So those are the when you talk about the grid representation, there's pivot charts and there's grids and there's a whole bunch of visualizations and so on. The ones that I have done that I'm going to show you some of, I've used cards, I've used grids, I've used charts, and I've used pies. That's it. No gauges, no chloropleth maps, no range filters, text box, geopoint maps, groups, scatter plots, images, tree map, tab combiners, filter elements, none of that. So once again, opportunity for you if this is something of interest to you, because this is actually really interesting. A lot of people are interested in this general topic of saying, how do I take this data and present it in a way that's useful? Right? It's really simple to say, I'm going to put a pie chart there, or I'm going to put some filtering here, but to make it truly useful, it takes some skill. And so there's opportunity for you to, from a participation perspective, to do that. Okay? So the ones, once again, the ones I'm going to show that and I'm not doing them here, I'm going to do them for the video module. Those are the features that they have. Okay? Now, one of the things is you'll see, maybe you'll see, when I start building them in the video module, what I've been unable to do is find any kind of common pattern in how all of these things work. Right? That's why, to me, it's a bunch of trial and error, because there's a little tiny bit of commonality, but pie charts versus grids versus, the pivot tables, they kind of work different ways. Okay? And again, this will probably make more sense when you see the video, but I wanted to point that out. And the reason I wanted to point that out is the same reason I want to talk about these key concepts. Because I promise you, if you just open up the builder and say, how do I build a dashboard, you're going to be totally lost. Okay, so without understanding, what the key concepts are. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about these key concepts here and then be done for today. So I mentioned before that the data sources, the data for the dashboard reports comes from 2 basic locations. You have the log, which are over here. So here are 2 example logs, and then here's the pull down list for all of them. So you have constraint log, material usage log, all of that kind of stuff. This stuff is all recorded if you have planning mode and so on. And then you have data tables, which we've made extensive use of already. And so you can use table data in combination with log data and so on. In order to use logs, you have to enable logging. Okay, and so we've done a little bit of this here. We've done the first couple. Run advanced options, enable interactive logging. So that was the very first thing we did. And when we did our model, when we did the planning mode, is if you go to run and advanced options, enable interactive logging. Okay, now remember what this does when you enable interactive logging is it logs the data when you run in interactive mode. So remember, we have interactive mode, we have planning mode, and we have experiment mode. So enable interactive logging logs when you're running in interactive mode, so if you're looking at this stuff in the results tab. Step 2 is if you look at the resource type objects like servers, there is an advanced option right here, log resource usage. Okay? And so you have to turn both of those things on, and that will then interactively log resource usage. A couple of things that we haven't done is if I go to a sync type object, there is an option to log time and system observations. Okay, and so remember when with the sync object from the standard library, every time an entity goes into the sync, Simio automatically computes the time and system for that entity. So it creates a tally statistic for that. And so if you turn this on, it will create a log for that. So if I jump over here to planning, for example, and go to logs on mine, here's my, there it is, my tally observation log. And so that's just all the record-based data for anything that went through that sync. Okay, so we have that, and then two other things that we didn't do also, or I didn't explicitly talk about, were with the material element and state statistic elements. So the material element, you want to log resource usage. Okay, and so to do that, if I go, I didn't do this on the video, sorry about that. I probably should have thought ahead and done it, but I didn't. If I go to definitions, and let's just add a material here. So that's a manually added material. Down here in advanced options, there is a log material usage. So if I set that equal to true, it will log every usage of that material. Okay? So just set that equal to true. Now remember, we're using data generated, so we didn't create these by hand. Okay, so get rid of this guy. I don't need him anymore. Go back to our data, materials. And in the one in the video, I only had 2 rows here. I had the initial quantity, assume infinite availability condition, and then I just added to that log material usage true. Okay, and that will turn on logging for all of the auto-generated materials. Okay, so that last row there is what you need to do. And you guys can now see the one that I have there. That's the one that works.
Yeah, I spelled it wrong. That was my problem.
Yeah. Trust me, there's not a worse speller on the planet than me, so I suffer that all the time. Okay, so you have to add that for logging. Now, one other thing while I'm here, if you have this model built, or any model built, and I go in and say add this to an existing table and then close it, that won't take effect for the currently existing materials. So you have to delete all the rows of the table and then paste them back in. Either bind it and read it back in, or just Control-C, Control-V, because that takes effect when the element is created. Okay, and so because the table is already there, the element's already created, so me going in and adding that data logging isn't going to affect the ones that are already there. If you delete all the rows from the table, they'll all go away, and then paste them back in, they'll all come back and they'll have that value set. Okay, and so when you do that, if you go and look, we then have material usage log. So that has all of the material usages, which has a huge amount of information that we are interested in from an inventory standpoint. And then state statistics in this model, in the one that I did, video module, I didn't have any state statistics, so I just created one that has the number of orders in the system. So I just created a state statistic, and remember, to create a state statistic, you have a state variable, and you say, I want to create a state statistic and watch this variable. So I have a state variable called current NIS, And then I have a state statistic where I set the log observations equal to true. And so obviously when an order arrives, so right here are my order arrivals, I increment that value to say I have a new one in the system, and when one leaves, I only had one row here to record the completion time of the order. I just decrement that value, so it just keeps track of the number in the system. And because I have that state statistic set to logging, it then shows me my state observation log. So this tells me that any time that state value changes, it shows me a whole bunch of information about that. Okay, so again, the idea here is that you have a whole lot of flexibility in what you log and what you don't log. If you have long-running models, it can create a lot of data, but sometimes you want a lot of data. Sometimes you don't need all the data, so you can decide what to do and what not to do. But this is one thing that people overlook, especially when you're first starting out, that if you don't log the data, if you don't explicitly tell it to log the data, the default action in almost all cases is not to log the data. Okay, so I just have this one example here. I'm not going to go through all the logs and talk about how they're used, but the resource usage log is a really simple one, because if you look at that top row of the resource usage log, you can see that's order.32, so that's the 32nd entity in the order population, right, which has a name owner order 1, and its start time, end time, duration, average, min, max, and all that. So that's the usage of kit 1 for that resource, and you can see that is right here in the Gantt chart, right? So to get this tooltip, I have the mouse hovered right over that. Okay, and so you can see that information comes directly from that row. And so the resource Gants, the entity workflow Gants are all taken from this log information, from several different components, right? So what you see here is just the basic information about the order, but if you look, we have constrained entities and all of that kind of information comes from the constraint log. Okay, so the logs are used internally to do the other planning features like the Gantt charts and all of that stuff and the targets and that kind of thing. And the idea of a dashboard is saying, okay, I want to create something different based on the same basic data. So two things that we've seen before without dashboards is we use the logs directly. Okay, so like for example, we were looking at I think I was doing the sequence dependent changeovers, right? One of the metrics that I used was sequence dependent changeovers. So if you go to the task log, I can go and say, okay, I want to just filter this to changeovers. And now I can instantly see all of my sequence dependent changeovers. Right, so I want to see who incurred a changeover, when they incurred a changeover, where they incurred a changeover, and so on. I can just use the log directly by filtering it to exactly what I want. Okay, similarly for case study 3, one of the things that was talked about in the discussion forum quite a bit was using the constraint log. Right, so if I look at the constraint log, and I can go and say, I want to go to constraint type. Constraint type, material availability, and there you go. So there's all of these times. So we talked about in the video using the status plot and all that, but you can also just go to the constraint log and see exactly. So for whatever run this is, I guess this, I don't know which one this is, order set D or something like that. We run out of blue paint at 4:50 p.m. on 2/17. Okay, so you look at the constraint log. So for the case study 3, I mean, one way to do case study 3 is to go in here and say, okay, well, write that number down. 2/17/22 at 4:50, and then jump over to my data table and say, okay, blue paint, let's just assume infinite availability. And then go back over to my planning and create plan. Now I have a new constraint log and blue paint's not there anymore, so the next thing that's going to run out here looks like it's box A. Right, so if you know how to use the constraint log, it will tell you all the information that you want. Okay, so typically when you think about using dashboards versus constraint logs or tables directly, when you're doing kind of one-off things or you're trying to understand what you want, it's a lot easier to just use the constraint logs directly. If for some reason I wanted this information all the time, like I did a weekly production or something and I want to know what I'm going to run out of when, I could then use this exact same information and make a dashboard where I don't have to do all the filtering and searching and it shows me everything at once. Okay, and that's the thing I deleted from when my student gave it to me, is he had all that, and I took all of it out. Okay. Let's see. What else was I going to talk about today? Did I stop my show? I guess I did. Resource log, and one thing that I will note for any of you who are out in the working world ever use this, if you have a true RPS license, we have academic RPS license, not a true RPS license. Another thing that you can do in the logs is you can add columns. Okay, so you can add columns that put any information that you want, and then it shows up in the tooltips here as additional details, and so you can track that. So for particular projects, I want some model-specific things. Right? In this case, this is the resource usage log, and they wanted to know what material is involved in this. Okay, so you're using a resource, and it's a material, it's an order entity, and so you want to know what material it's interested in. So you can actually modify how the log works. You can't do that with ours, but you can do it if you happen to have an RPS license. Really useful. Okay, a couple more really simple concepts, and then we'll be done. This notion of calculated field. So a calculated field, if I look at a log, or I look at a table, we know what table columns are. You define the table columns, and for the log, Simio defines it, unless you have RPS and you define your own, right? But calculated fields are new fields that you create based on some type of expression, usually an algebraic or a logical expression. And you can think of it as, if you think of a log as a table of data, creating a new column. It doesn't really create the column, so when you go back to the log, the column's not there. But the data's there for this particular dashboard. So if I have a calculated field in this one, like table orders, and I create the calculated field, it doesn't actually add the column to the data table. The data table orders. It's just in the dashboard logic, but you can think of it logically as that. So with calculated fields, you can add all kinds of information. So this is the calculated field for the complex scorecard that I showed you. And you see we calculate the status, and you can read that if condition. What we're doing is we're comparing the completion date to the, we're computing lateness. We're trying to say, is something late? Is something unshipped? Is something on time? So we're using the completion date, saying if that's null, then it's unshipped. Then we're using this other calculated field called late, which is just a Boolean whether the completion date is greater than the due date. It's just a Boolean field. We can use those computed fields in other logical expressions. And so you'll see when we start building dashboards, what you're doing is you're using these calculated fields to do things like, when I click here, turn this off. When I click here, turn that off. Okay, so you're using those kind of computed things. There's this nice expression editor here that helps you build these. If you know that, you can just start typing it, or you can just double click here and it will help you out. Okay, these are usually pretty straightforward to do if you know Boolean logic and max and min. It does aggregation, sum, and things like that. And you'll see some of those examples. And as I said, calculated fields are really commonly used for data filtering. I want to filter on late orders. Or this one field that you see here, status, where I'm saying unshipped, later on time, that particular field is what we use for that card that said, you could click on any one of those and see all the that belong to that category. Okay, so I can show you that because we're going to use that in the next slide too. So go back here, and that status field is the one let's see here, results. This card right here. So let me clear the filter, clear the filter. That's the completely unfiltered field. And so that one calculated field where we had late on time and shipped was used to create this card. And so that when I say it's used for filtering, if I want to see all the unshipped ones, it's using that. It's using that calculated field. Okay? I think the next to the last thing is something called filtering and interactivity. I guess this is two things. Filtering is one and interactivity is another. So filtering basically chooses a subset of the data. Okay, so you think about order table, if all orders, late orders, orders that haven't shipped, and so on. right? And so filtering is just the normal, when you think about database, so you think about spreadsheets and all that, filtering is a pretty normal concept. I'm going to tell you ahead of time, filtering in the Simio dashboards, depending on your card layout, can be just a little bit confusing because you have a master filter, then you have sub-filters and so on. So I can't give you any specific rules on how to do that, but just be aware that the overall filtering takes a little getting used to. Interactivity specifies how when I do something in one element of the dashboard, it affects the other. Okay, so as I said, when I was going to demonstrate this, if I go here and say, click here, you note it affects this one and this one and this one and this one, right? All of these get updated as soon as I click there. And so that's what we mean by interactivity. And so, for example, if I were to go to my orders table, I'm not going to edit the thing here, but if I were to edit the dashboard and just go to this one little component of the card and say, ignore the master filter, then I can click on the late orders and it doesn't affect these at all. Right? So you have to decide for this interactivity, what do you want to exit filter, what do you want to show all the time, and so on. Okay, so filter and interactivity. Important concepts. And here's what I was talking about this ignore master filters. The one thing I can tell you, though, is when you look at this interactivity, the one I have selected right here, which is multiple master filter, is what lets me choose multiple things. So you can see I have finish 1, finish 2, finish 3 all chosen. And so it filters based on all of those conditions. Right? And so in this dashboard, you can see I have finish 1, finish 2, and finish 3. So I see these 3 separately, and then I see them aggregated here. If I just clicked on finish 1, it would just show one of these, and here there's nothing to aggregate, 2, and so on. So it does that aggregation for me. If I had this one chosen, then it wouldn't let me select multiple. It would only let me select one. Okay, so if you don't want to allow this aggregation across multiple entities, then you want to use that single master filter. And then again, right here, ignore master filters is saying, okay, if he filters it to only late orders, for whatever element that I have this chosen for, it's going to ignore that. It's going to ignore that filtering. And then for the kind of, if you think about it, one of the control components, cross data source filtering will let you do multiple data sources filtering. So maybe I have, the dashboards are really smart, and they know that if you're using, say, the material name from the material usage log, in any component of the dashboard, it knows what that is. The cross data source filtering will try to help you. If I use a table and something else and they both have the same name, it tries to help me out there. But there's no way for it to have a direct link all the time. But that's what that element's for. And then lastly, there are experiment reports. So all of the reports that dashboard reports that we're going to do in this class are in planning mode and in interactive mode. That's what we're going to do. But there are experiment dashboards too. So experiment dashboards use all of the data from the Simio experiment. So like, when you run an experiment, you have scenarios and replications, and it has all of the data behind it on the responses and all of that kind of stuff. All of that stuff is available for experiment dashboards. And those are really useful if you're doing statistical experiments where you want to have statistical validity, you want to compare scenarios across replications and things like that. You can use the same basic structure, the same basic dashboard structure. You just have these different data sources. And there is a Simbit dashboards with experiments that will I'll show you how to do that. So again, it's a really useful tool if you're doing sort of non-scheduling simulation, like if you're using the simulation model to do some design experiments or something like that. That's where those types of dashboards become useful. Okay. So again, the last thing I will leave you with here is these key concepts. These are the things that are really important. Obviously, the elements that we have, the grid type visualization cards, but data sources, calculated fields, filtering, interactivity, those things are important. Understanding just kind of at a high level here that, it's got to get data from somewhere, so you have to have the logging set correctly, calculate fields so that you can either do filtering based on conditions, or you can calculate fields like the minimum or the maximum or something like that. Filtering is pretty clear. And then this notion of interactivity where one element in a dashboard impacts other elements in the dashboard is that interactivity component. Okay? All right, any last questions for me? Okay, so as I said, we're going to start case study 4 probably next week. You guys have done 3 case studies, and I've got like exactly 0 feedback on, hey, these are too easy. Hey, these are too hard. Hey, I've spent an hour on this. I've spent 1,000 hours on this. So I don't know whether you guys think these are taking too long or not taking too long. So if you care to share an opinion, share it with me before we finalize case study 4, because kind of at the crossroads between do we add another problem or do we just leave it as is or something like that. Okay? All right, see you guys next time.